Welcome to the Bible Passages Podcast.
Luke is recording these events of early Christianity.
Today we're talking about a city that has a few well-known events recorded for us in the Bible.
Then he comes to Troas on that western coast of what's Asia Minor today, or Turkey, and he receives the Macedonian call.
At the ancient city of Philippi, there are several old churches and many ancient sites that can still be seen today.
You know, what all did Paul encounter? What was going on? You know, for us to better understand some of the specific things in Acts 16.
We hope that you'll enjoy this episode of the Bible Passages Podcast.
So the same thing, by the way, that happened 2,000 years ago is happening today. And that's one of the beauties of the great gospel message.
Today, as usual, I'm here with John Moore. And how are things going today, John?
Hey, going great. Just fine. In fact, this will be old hat, I guess, by the time everybody hears this, but right in the middle of the election cycle. So the presidential race is up for grabs here. Just went and voted not long ago. Things are going well. Went and had conducted a marriage seminar down up in Fort Worth, Texas at the Brown Trail Church of Christ. And that went great. We're staying busy and just being blessed by the Lord. That's for certain.
That's great to hear. It's actually kind of interesting. How long's it been for? Hopefully, for those listening, it'll be just a week. But for us, it's been three busy weeks between episodes. So you were in Idaho, and I was in Missouri for a time, and happy to be back doing this today. And I'm excited to talk about what we're going to talk about today. So we are going to be talking about the ancient city of Philippi. Once again, we get into the Greek pronunciation. Our Greek guide last time we were
Philippi, for all of those that are from America, they're going to be listening to this. That's how we typically think of it. But yeah, so Philippi, there you go.
I think we will definitely go with Philippi, but kind of a quick funny story about that. The town that my dad grew up in West Virginia is Philippi, and it's spelled the exact same way. And so when our Greek guide last time we were there said that we were off to Philippi, that was a word I'd heard before. But obviously, when we read our Bible in English, we're talking about Philippi. And Philippi, for those of you who don't know, if we can put ourselves in a geographical context, it is in the northern part of what's modern day Greece. There used to be a region up there called Macedonia, and Macedonia was really what we now call the northern part of Greece. And it's a town that's not too far from the coast, something that plays into the biblical narrative, where Paul lands in a certain place and then he immediately goes to Philippi. That's because it's not too far from the coast. And as with much of Greece, it is a plain city in a mountainous continent. And so there's not a ton of mountains per se in Philippi, as it's in the plain, but that's just the geography of Greece in general. So, John, what else do you think we need to know about Philippi before we get started?
Well, yeah, it's not right on the coast, but I think one of the reasons why it developed where it did was because of the mining in the area. You know, if you go back to the history of Philip of Macedon, he was who was the father, Philip Macedon II. Philip II of Macedon was invited to come in there and kind of help a local nation defend that area. And as a result, he took advantage of that, built a city there. That's why it's named Philippi. But so basically to protect the mines, and the gold and silver mines that were in the area. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, since we're getting kind of into the history of it, that's exactly what happened. So Philip of Macedon was the father of Alexander the Great. And he conquered parts of that area, and he especially had an interest in this area that had a lot of mining. So he conquers this town, he names it after himself, and it really enjoys kind of an economic boom for a little while the mining is still good. But as sometimes happens in mining communities, the mines went dry a little bit, and it had a period where it was not really shrinking, not really growing. But it also, or rather, it became important again because of its relationship with Rome. There's actually a pretty famous battle that happened right around Philippi Brutus and Cassius, who are the assassinators of Caesar, met Octavian and Antony, and they were really fighting for control of what became the Republic of, or not the Republic, the Empire of Rome, and they were kind of fighting in this power vacuum um, after Caesar was assassinated several years later. And what that led to was a large Roman presence. So, John, did I get all the details right, or do you have something to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, that is definitely what I think a lot of historians call the death of the Republic, the site where the Republic of Rome officially ends, and Caesar's death is avenged for sure. A little bit later on, the Battle of Actium, I think about 9 years or so later, it takes place where then finally, Mark Antony actually kind of switches sides, becomes an opponent of Octavian, but yeah, so Augustus definitely asserts his dominance, his power here, and he becomes, eventually, essentially the first emperor of Rome. And you may gonna mention this, and I think this is important, especially as it begins to think about the connection to biblical times, or as far as when the New Testament was written, that it became a Roman colony because when the Battle of Actium, after it was finished, a lot of the land, as sort of a pension plan, was given to the retired soldiers who had served Octavian in that battle, and for a long time were allowed to resettle that land, and so it became not only a Roman colony, but definitely one that was permeated by the military.
Yeah, and I don't know that we have a parallel in American times, but as the exactly what you said, as the soldiers got land, that land was what they received for their service. And again, a lot of them settled there. Well, why does that matter? We talk a lot about how the Bible takes place in very much a Roman context. And in some ways that's very, very good. There's a lot of good things. We're going to talk briefly about the Via Ignatia, which is a road that runs through Philippi, but it can also be a bad thing. A heavy Roman influence could be detrimental to an early church, or even as you get into the later half of the first century and into the second century, um, a very Roman city does not is not going to play nicely with a heavily Christian city in that period of time. So it's interesting to note those things and to know a little bit about the history and the geography of how this place came to be.
Well, and I think when we, eventually in the course of this podcast get to the book of Philippians, some of those passages that are well known passages about citizenship and about the colony, that I think needs to be understood against the backdrop of the very things you've been talking about.
I only have one more thing really about the geography, and you may have more, but I mentioned the Via Ignatia. It's a good way to kind of talk about the world at large. One thing we've talked about, I believe, in other episodes, or if not, we'll talk about it in future episodes, I'm sure. But the several places in the Paul's writings, he references that the Christ came in the fullness of time. There could be a lot of interesting things said about that, but why was it the fullness of time? Well, one of the reasons it was the fullness of time is because of all of the things that had been ushered in by previous civilizations. And specifically for our discussion, the thing that the Romans did was they built the roads that ultimately carried the gospel. And so what Paul did, he had a missionary strategy. He wasn't just kind of out meandering around. He started on the road that connected all these popular cities together. And as he went, he stopped and evangelized and taught and did that kind of thing. So two major roads. Via Ignatia is the major east-west road that really connected uh, parts north and east and west to Rome, and then the Appian Way, or the Via Appia, went north south down the peninsula of Italy. So Philippi, being on the Ignatia or the Via Ignatia Ignatian Way, is really the MO for Paul as he's trying to evangelize the ancient world.
Yeah, absolutely. So utilizing the cultural events of the day, the background, all of that's important if we're going to try to understand and appreciate the Bible, but also understand the providential element of God's bringing about the kingdom of God when He did at the right and perfect time, right? And as you mentioned, utilizing the road system, this main road system that went from Philippi actually all the way over to eventually what would be Constantinople. So east to west over the western side of the Greek peninsula there, and the Greek island or peninsula. So utilizing that, and then also understanding the cultural context in which these New Testament books were written, and as we get to the Book of Acts here in just a moment, thinking about um, what all did Paul encounter, what was going on, and how that the Roman Greek sort of culture was the backdrop for us to better understand some of the specific things in Acts 16. So I don't know, there's some other things you want to mention before we get to Acts 16 or not, or that you feel are important.
Well, I think that really does gives the backdrop. And so let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's figure out what's going on in Acts 16. So, John, why don't you walk us through that?
Yeah, well, okay. So as we study through the book of Acts, let's remember that this is Luke's account, who was with Paul on his missionary journeys, and Acts 16 is the beginning of the so-called we passages. And so evidently, as Luke is writing this, he's saying now he's with Paul, and here's what we did. So Luke accompanied him and Silas and others, and then at other times he's not with him. But Luke is recording these events of early Christianity, what took place at the establishment of the church in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, as recorded in Acts chapter 2. And then, if you go back to chapter 1, verse 8, you have sort of an outline for the entirety of the book, where Luke tells us that they've been given this great commission to go into Jerusalem, Judea, and then into Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. So chapters 1 through 7 of the book of Acts is all about the spread of the gospel in Jerusalem and Judea. 8 through 12 is about the spread of the gospel in Samaria, that northern region just north of Jerusalem, Judea. And then chapters 13 through 28 is about, the focus is on Paul's missionary journeys and others that are with him, and where all he goes. So when we get to Acts 16 now, Paul is actually on his second missionary tour, and he's been sent out by the church at Antioch Antioch of Syria, and he's gone back to visit some of the places that he had hit early on in his first journey, the so-called what we call the first journey. Bible doesn't really call it that specifically, but anyway, so then he comes to Troas on that western coast of what's Asia Minor today, or Turkey, and he receives the Macedonian call. And remember, as you pointed out, Macedon is a former territory of the Greek Empire that has now become a province of the Roman Empire. They have control over this area. And so a man of Macedonia is saying, come over and help us, and that's in Acts 16. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that the church is already established there? Or does it mean that this is an angelic person or entity that's saying, okay, come over and help us fight the forces of evil by establishing the church? A lot of debate about what that entails, but the point is that Paul leaves Asia, and he goes to Europe. And so you can read about that in Acts 16. And so we get to verse number 11 of Acts 16. And so he sets sail from Troas, and he makes his way, stops at an island there along the way, and then he lands at Neapolis, which is just a word that means new city. It was a new place that the Romans had built there as a harbor city, and immediately makes his way then on up to Philippi. And maybe we'll come back to this a little bit later, but want to mention something about having actually stopped there and walked on that Appian Way up on the Via Ignatia up to Philippi. But yeah, so that's where we are in Acts 16. He goes to Philippi, and then the Bible mentions several things that occur there. So you want to just summarize really quickly, Brian, what are the events that occurred there, and then we'll come back and talk about them.
Just one more geographical note, and I think everybody probably already knows, but um, just remember that we're crossing oceans again. So, oceans in quotes, please. Seas, really. We're crossing bodies of water again. We are, you can get from where Paul was to modern day Philippi by driving, but he got on a boat and went to Samothrace. And remember that the Spirit prevented him from going into Asia. Well, Asia is that province that's in modern day south western Turkey. And so when John said that he sailed from Asia over to Greece, well, that is crossing continents, but really Asia in the Roman world was that little southwestern Turkey province, and Ephesus is there, and of course the other six churches mentioned in Revelation are the seven churches of Asia. It's that province right there, and so he gets into Philippi, and then uh, you may remember in Acts, Paul again had a plan every time that he was evangelizing. He always went to the synagogue. Well, if there wasn't a synagogue, then he's going to go to a place of prayer. He's going to look for these spiritual people. And so he goes into the city and finds the place of prayer on the Sabbath. And he runs into a woman named Lydia. And it tells that she was a seller of purple goods and a worshiper of God. That term worshiper of God is familiar to us, understanding that there were Gentiles who were interested in godly things, but there was not enough Jews in this city to have a synagogue. Maybe we'll talk about that in a second. So she kind of imposes upon them, insists that Paul come and stay with her, and um, Paul ultimately teaches and baptizes her with her household, and again, she invites them to stay in their house. Um, we can go. What are you thinking, John? You want to talk about that some more, or do you want me to go all the way
Well, I was just
through?
saying, just to remind everybody that that's the first is the baptism, of Lydia, as you mentioned, and then secondly, he goes into the city, and that's where he's going to encounter this slave girl who is possessed with this what some translations say is spirit of divination, and then he cast out this evil spirit out of her. A lot of things to be said about that in just a moment. And then remember, the people that owned this slave girl were rather upset because they saw that the means of their earning money through her, and what people why they were coming to her to receive information. And so anyway, they were losing their livelihood, and so they drugged Paul and Silas before the magistrates, and basically accused them of doing things that were unlawful according to the Roman Empire. And so a riot ensues, and they take Paul, they and Silas, and they strip them of their clothes, they beat them, and they put them in prison. And then after that, there's an earthquake, and the jailer, thinks that they've escaped, and he's about to kill himself. And Paul says, "Do yourself no harm." And then they teach him the gospel, and he and his family are baptized into Christ. So you've got a Philippian jailer and his family. You've got Lydia, a seller of purple, and all this is happening. That become a part of the family of God, all right here at Philippi. So it's a great missionary effort, and a lot of things have happened, but there are also a number of other smaller things that are of great significance and maybe questions that arise. But what a wonderful story. And then ultimately, Paul lets them know that he's a Roman citizen, and they release him. And he goes on then to Thessalonica.
There's a lot that happens here, and because of that, there are some cool things that actually can be seen here. So I think where I want to start is with the baptismal site of Lydia, what's so called the baptismal site of Lydia. So the Bible does not say where they were on a river. It says that Paul went outside of the gate that's going to be the city gate to the riverside where there was where we suppose there was a place of prayer. And again, the we in that is going to be Luke as well. And so uh, we're not told where this is on the riverside. So, as with many things in Bible geography, we have an idea of where this could be. there are rivers, obviously, in this area. There's the ancient city, but there's no place where we can definitively say that there was a Jewish place of prayer or a place of prayer from these uh, uh, women um, in Philippi. That being said, there is a place that's traditionally called the baptismal site of Lydia, and there's a lot of cool things that are there. What was your favorite part about that, John?
Well, it's, as you noted today, it's not in the archaeological site. You have to go not too far. I mean, it's a very, very short drive, maybe like 5 minutes or less on the bus to go from the archaeological site to this place. And there is a modern setting that's been created with a little sort of small amphitheater, and they channeled the water over just a bit to create a little baptismal site. But the nice thing about this little place, even though there's a little gift shop there, really rudimentary small gift shop and some bathrooms, and there are also some Roman um, stelas there. That probably if funerary inscriptions on these from Hospital Cemetery in that area. But and then there's a modern day Greek Orthodox chapel there. But other than that, and those are all very small. It's still very picturesque. It's still very, I guess, much like I kind of envision it would have been during that day. It's kind of in a rural area, and so a lot of trees along this small. It's a small river. Really, probably in some parts of the country, the United States, people would think of it as more of a creek or something. But the water was flowing through there good. But yeah, very picturesque, very I guess scenic, and peaceful. Very peaceful.
Yeah, I that was a cool place, and of course, when we were there last, we were actually there on a Sunday. And one of the really neat places or neat things that we get to do when we're on these trips and tours, and we hope that you'll join us for one of those one day. But is we get to worship, and we get to worship in some places that maybe we don't know of a church, or maybe we're in between places that have a church, but there's a large group of us, and of course we're empowered to worship as that group. And so we got to worship there by the riverside, and one of the ministers that was on the trip, who's now a minister of Bear Valley, Sage, gave a tremendous lesson right there. And it's kind of amazing to think about how the very beginnings of Christianity, right? That's what Acts is describing, involved this picturesque riverside and some preaching and some worshiping, and we got to relive that in the same way that they would have if they ever met out there for worship, where we got to sit down together and sing praises to God, and to take the Lord's Supper and to hear His Word read. And it was just a really uplifting morning, mid morning, when we were there last.
Yeah, and I want to just mention something while we're here, because sometimes this question comes up, and you briefly touched on it at the top of the podcast, and that is, was there a synagogue in this place? We don't have any archaeological evidence that there was a synagogue at this time when Paul goes there. There is archaeological evidence and information later on that a synagogue was established there. But so if there's not, as you mentioned, this makes a great place for people to gather, and quiet place to have some time. Is that what this is, a gathering of Jewish women? Or is it that, as we know, there were people in the Roman world who were monotheists, that were influenced by Jews? There's several times in Scripture that the Bible calls certain people God-fearers, or like Cornelius, who was not a Jew, but he was a man who feared God and gave alms. And I think that he, along with some others, and we know this from the writings of Philo, an ancient historian, that the Jews left an imprint and a mark on some people in the Gentile world with regard to a monotheistic view, and a view of integrity and character in a lot of ways. So I think there were people who were maybe attracted to that and drawn to that. Is that what's going on here? Are these Jewish women, or are they just Gentile women who believe in God? We don't know, but we do know they have gathered in prayer. They've gathered to think about God, and Paul takes advantage of that to tell them about Jesus, and as a result, they're baptized into Christ. So one of the things that, as you mentioned, when we're there, we do is to like to talk about, well, what is baptism? What's it for? What precedes that? Why would someone want to become a Christian, or why would someone be led to the waters of baptism? What's actually occurring here? So that's one thing, to point out while you're there, and to just give people an opportunity to. We've done this the last couple of times we were there, is to say, everybody spread out up and down the river, go where you want, or you can stay right here at this little small amphitheater. Spend some time in private devotion and praying to God and thinking about what's going on. And having worked at camps, church camps over the years, I've seen a lot of kids baptized in rivers and in creeks, late at night at different times. And so being down there sort of reminds me of that, to think, well, 2,000 years before these kids were being baptized out here at a place called Hensel Camp in Austin, Texas, there were there were people like Lydia being baptized in a river. And so it's just really neat to think about maybe some that had gathered there. They come down to that river. They sang maybe a song. Had been hearing this preaching, and she's ready to confess that Jesus is the Christ. And and Paul or somebody goes down in the water with her and immerses her into Christ. And what rejoicing must have been going on that day. So the same thing, by the way, that happened 2,000 years ago is happening today. And that's one of the beauties of the great gospel message and its timeliness. So that's one thing. And then there's some other things I want to say about this site, but maybe there's something else you want to pitch in.
Well, because we're talking about it, I mean, the one of my favorite things, or has become one of my favorite things, is finding baptistries in other parts of the world. And the one at this site we're talking about, this baptismal site of Lydia, it's modern. I want to get that out of the way. It's not a an ancient baptismal site, but they have made. John kind of alluded to it. They've basically diverted the river and made a place where it's kind of deep enough for immersion. Creek is an appropriate word, I think. It's not the biggest, widest river that has ever existed, and so you need a place that is deep enough for immersion. But it's also like many ancient baptistries in the form of a cross, and exactly what John is talking about, the connections to his time at camp. But it reminds us of Romans 6, where we are baptized in like manner to his death, where we are actually taking our old man, our old desires, and our old self and crucifying it. So the early church in the fourth century, when church buildings start to be built, they wanted to build baptistries, and so they wanted them to be in the shape of a cross. And so, even though it's modern, anytime I can find a baptistry that's in the shape of a cross, I'm a big fan of pointing that out and talking about that. And the other thing from the site, John mentioned an Orthodox church that's right there. Happens to be a particular favorite of mine because when you walk in the door, there's a massive mosaic map on the floor. And so, John and I, anytime there's a a map, I think we get excited. And so it's very ornately decorated, as a lot of Orthodox churches are. But as soon as you walk in, almost like in a foyer area, there's a large mosaic map that's right there on the floor. And then one more thing that I have, you may have more thoughts on the site. I did buy a seashell there, or shell, whatever I guess it's not a seashell necessarily. And the reason I did that is because that is what the purple goods were made out of. So the reason the text makes mention of that, we're not told exactly, but a seller of purple, purple was a very expensive material, and it was expensive because it was resource and time consuming. Basically, they would take these shells that I got one of while I was there, and they would go through a process that was pretty time intensive, and they would make purple. And they showed us some of the purple there, and it really was more like a red almost. At least what they showed us, it almost was a scarlet color, but still a very neat connection. Lydia being a seller of purple, Obviously, I had to get a shell that made the purple dye.
Yeah. Well, did you I've got one right here. I don't know if you got yours available, but
Yeah,
there it is,
well,
a Murex,
for those on
and,
the podcast,
yeah, there you go.
small plug to go
Yeah. I mean,
online
it
and
looks like an ocean a small ocean, seashell and for a little, a sea snail to be hiding in, and, yeah, they extracted that. There was a certain little small gland that they got out of there, and then there's a small bit of fluid, right, that's used, and it took thousands of those to be able to create enough dye to dye one garment. So yeah, and I've heard kind of all kinds of figures about it being it's worth its weight in gold, 2 or 3 times, worth its weight, or even more. I have no way of knowing how to be able to assess that except just reading what others say. But and by the way, I there is an article, now that we're on this just for a moment, that it's at ResearchGate. It's a pretty interesting article about what's the matter with Lydia's purple, and it's a play on words because they're saying that maybe her purple was. And some commentators have argued this that it wasn't from the murex cell; that her purple in Thyatira was from a madder root, and yet they're arguing in this article no that that there's been enough testing done to know that it did come from a murex shell, and so high quality purple. But yeah, and that, I think we need to come back at another time and talk about that because it's interesting how that is even the kind of purple that's spoken of and used as a dye on the priestly garments and in the tabernacle and the curtains. And there's even been a book written about because this art was lost about how to get that color out of there, and then it resurfaced in within the last 100 years or so, and but about how to do it and where it came from and the color that was actually used during that time. But yeah, interesting. By the way, uh, is there? Do you want to make a point about why, if she's from Thyatira, why is she here in Philippi? You thought about that?
yeah, I don't know that I gave that much thought off the cuff. What are you thinking?
Well, and I mean, no one knows 100% certain, except there was an inscription found, and as I understand it now, no one really knows where it is, but it was discovered many years ago and then recorded, and then the actual inscription was lost. But uh, basically, it was an honorific inscription to a person who had given money, who had was selling this dye in Philippi, and so for whatever reason, Lydia and maybe some others have come over because Thyatira is a major area where that was produced, and now they've come over to Philippi. Well, I guess you're gonna. It's like a lot of places, right? If the market gets saturated in one area, maybe you move to another area where it's closer for people to be able to find that dye and to have garments dyed as opposed to having to go all the way to Thyatira. I don't know, but we do know that there was a trade there, so it makes sense that she would come and maybe start up a business there. So we've got, as another little side note, an indication of some very successful women from that time period. And I want to mention something a little later again about maybe some of the myths associated with women's role in ancient Greek and Roman society, though a lot said about that. But yeah, so it's a very neat thing to think about. And then there's something else about this little baptismal site, like you said, that Greek chapel, that Greek Orthodox church building there. Um, but there's one other thing that while you're there, um, that you want to be sure and notice, and that is these. There's just what looks like the remnants of an old Roman cemetery with some funerary kind of monuments there, inscriptions, and one of them has a emblem of a fasces on there, and that was an important symbol of the Roman Empire. That was essentially some rods wrapped around an axe, and the axe head was sticking out, and these rods, wooden rods, are then held together by a piece of leather, and those were carried by certain individuals in the Roman Empire as a sort of symbol of authority and maybe by someone who was sort of like law enforcement agent of some sort. We know that some of the emperors of Rome, in fact, several of them had these that they had men carry with them when they went from place to place, maybe to an important event. These men were sometimes called lictors, and they just a symbol of the divine authority, or not divine authority, but the authority, the power, the sovereignty, as a means of bringing force upon people who do not abide by the emperor's rule, and that you're to show reverence and respect. And hence, our word fascist comes from that word fascis, that emblem that was on that particular stela. And it wasn't just given to just anybody. Again, it had to be someone who was given Roman authority in a very powerful way. And you've got one of those right there at Philippi, which plays in a little bit, I think, to the story a little bit later on that we're going to see when they beat Paul and Silas with rods. It's the same Greek word found there, that they were beaten with rods. Now, I'm not saying it was that fascist or whatever, but my point is this is a term that's used. You find it there at Philippi. So be sure you notice that when you go there, right when you are heading down to the river.
Well, and on if you want to see one of these, right, it might actually be easier to go to the baptismal site than it is to find a dime these days. But on the back of the dime, there is a facsimile, or there's a picture of one, kind of what we're looking at. It's a bundle of rods together, and it's um, got a head on it of some kind. So that's even the Greek and Roman culture has worked its way all the way into our American culture in that regard.
Yeah, it's on the Lincoln Memorial, by the way. If you go there, there's a depiction of it. It's not real noticeable, but there's a couple of them actually there as well. So, but anyway, all right. So that's that site. Anything else before we move on to another site?
Yeah, I think we should talk about the actual archaeological site.
Well, when you get there, it is, it's not maybe as massive as a number of places that we visited, but it's still, pretty good layout, and a lot of archaeological ruins, a lot of things to see. And, the kind of the path that we took, just give a quick highlights of it, was that when you come in, you first encounter the theater, first built by Philip, and that we mentioned earlier, Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, and then it was expanded or remodeled in some way, I should say, by the Romans a little bit later on. But so you encounter that, and then as you make your way from the theater, one of the first things you see is a church building, the remains of an ancient church building from the about the fourth century, if I'm not mistaken, fourth fifth century A.D., and they call it Basilica A. And the word basilica was a Roman word used to describe a governmental building where that the Romans utilized for various judicial proceedings, court rulings, or gathering places for important, political events or whatever. But what happened is that when Christianity then became the dominant force in the Roman Empire, then they started utilizing these basilicas and turning them into church buildings. Now, I don't know if that one there was actually a Roman building first, but the term is definitely adopted. They definitely adopt the buildings and the building style, and as far as their church buildings. And so you have a church building built there, and then another one that is across the way from the Forum, and then a third in church building that we'll talk about in a moment. So it's a reminder that while though Christianity started off in a challenging way, right, with Paul being imprisoned there because of what he did in casting out those demons, the church grew over time, and it became a very big stronghold for Christianity in the fourth, fifth century A.D. in the years that followed. But so you go there, and then you go down to a place. Do you remember, Brian, that has a little title on it called where Paul was imprisoned?
There's a lot to mention about that. Before you get off the church buildings real fast, though, I did have one thing to say about that. So you mentioned that, and I think you're right. There is at least one basilica here that was in the fourth century, and I don't know if you're like me, but I always think I'm like fourth century. What in the world do I care about a church that was you know, 400 years after Christ. Well, first, back up. Fourth century means 300 to 400. So it's only 300 years after Christ. And then if you think um, about the timeline, you have to remember what happened at the turn of the fourth century. The Christianity was persecuted heavily between 100 and 300, and with varying degrees of local persecution and national persecution. It wasn't like for 200 years there was this systematic constant persecution, but the idea of a church building was foreign, because if Rome was not sympathetic to the church, then there's no way we could have a public building where we all met together. Um, People still met in houses, and they still met locally with one another again in houses. And so a fourth century church building is going to be among the earliest that you can find, because Christianity wasn't really accepted or tolerated the way it was enough to support a church building until the fourth century. So, I think that bears mentioning, because I always think, I'm like, fourth century, that's so long after the first century. Well, in one way it is, but in one way it's not. There's, again, Christianity at that time just became tolerated enough where they were allowed to have buildings.
Well, and it is interesting that then going south, so across the forum that we'll talk about in just a moment, but there is the remains of another church building. It's actually two or three in it that have been built one on top of the other, kind of more or less, or expanded. It reminds me a lot of the evolution of the church building in Capernaum, just northwest of the Sea of Galilee, where you have evidence of a sort of small residential area where people were meeting, because of some indication of Christian iconography that was found on the walls of some of these buildings, but evidently some sort of site that was venerated in some way and considered to be important. And the walls then were expanded, and then the next generation comes along and they build a kind of a larger structure over it, or utilize that same thing, much like we do today. You see a lot of church buildings that start off small and then they add on and they knock out walls and all of that, and that's what was happening in this site. So I think you definitely, like Scripture reveals, they were meeting in homes, maybe some larger places next to the synagogue or whatever, and then uh, maybe they realize we need more room. They break out some of the walls, they expand it, and then it wasn't long before the fourth century comes along, and they're building hexagonal church buildings like is there, and then larger structure with a baptistry and the house of a bishop is adjoined to it. So it's growing and developing. That's the same thing at Capernaum. So what we see today in our own culture is what was happening back then as well, in terms of the development of these meeting places.
I have to think every time, okay, what, situation are we in, or what time period are we in? But John mentioned, so once you walk past that church building, you get to the end, and John mentioned uh something, and it's, you know, John and I talk about this all the time. The Bible geography is kind of interesting in some ways like this. We really search for the exact rock, or the exact place, or the exact room. And obviously, one of the largest events that happened in the reading of Acts 16 is that they were thrown into prison. And so there is a room, and that's about all I'll say about that. And it's got a sign, and it says Paul's prison. Um, Now, as with a lot of things, that most likely was not actually Paul's prison. And John, why don't you? I think you've probably got a lot more insight into this, but why do things get labeled as the artifact when they're not actually the artifact?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly happens a lot. And let me say, first of all, yeah, I think that really what you're looking at when you go there and you see that signage that says where Paul was in prison was as an ancient cistern connected somehow to a Roman building that then maybe provided some sort of water source for that basilica up above. But it's definitely later. I don't know very many people that at all would suggest now that that's where it was. But Okay, so answer your question is that I think all of us are interested in going back. Some people call them pilgrimages. Some people just are, have a lot of curiosity and interest in being able to demonstrate and show the reliability of Scripture. Well, you go there. There's a city of Philippi. There are all these sort of connections that we can make culturally to say that Luke was very specific and accurate about things. And so the next question is, well, this was a major event where Paul was in prison. Where was it? And so to be able to find a room brings maybe the archaeologist, the researcher, or somebody some notoriety, but also I think in some ways, sadly, two things happen. One is it is a marketing scheme. It's a way to get people to come and say, "Hey, could it be that we have found Paul's prison?" And so people will go and want to investigate it, and then before long, maybe someone puts up a sign because someone said that it was at one point. I notice this happens a lot in uh, archaeological news over social media or just over media in general. That as clickbait, some of the journalist will say Paul's prison found, but it'll be in quotes or something, or ancient zigzag discovered. And but then as you read through the article, there are all these qualifying statements about, it's presumed, it's thought, maybe, could be, but various people disagree. But it's too late because now the people that just read the headlines of those articles have passed it on to everybody else. And at church next Sunday, then people say, "Hey, did you see that they discovered Paul's prison?" Well, no, not exactly. That's not what was said, in just that way. But I think we certainly as Christians look for something tangible. We want to be able to say this is where it happened, this is it, and we just really need to be careful about going to a very specific place and saying this is the rock. Now, generally, absolutely, there's no question about whether or not that's the city of Philippi. And there's no question about whether or not there was a Roman Forum and all of that. Now, much of what you're looking at in terms of the Roman Forum was actually second century or third century, built a little bit after the time of Paul because of an earthquake and everything that happened. And so they rebuilt it, but still the foundations are there, same kinds of structures. There are a number of remains that do go back to that time. But again, what do you find? There is this what's called verisimilitude. If you read it in scripture, you ought to find something that's similar to it in the archaeological record. And so, were there any prisons? Were there any forums? Was there a place? Was there a river? What was there? Were there temples? Was there a religious fervor to pay homage to, or to think importantly about a spirit of divination? Yes, yes. I mean, we see all of that, but to go and say, "Well, we have found, the spirit of divination right here," you're not going to do that. You're going to find that. But there is this strong, again, what some call verisimilitude, this parallel between what you see in the archaeological record and what you read in Scripture. So, but while though Paul's prison hasn't been found, there have been a lot of other interesting things that have been found.
I want to make a connection before we go on to that. I think one of the things that we can do is fall victim to this idea that I want it to be Paul's prison, right? I want to be able to stand in the place and say, this is where Paul was, and he was. They were in prison, they were singing, and this is where the earthquake was, and this is the gate that came off. Um, we have to be careful of that to make an application or a connection. We have to be careful with that in our Christianity as well. There are things and realities that I want to be true, but if I start to stray outside of the evidence, and that's what we're talking about, right? There's very little evidence that that was a prison. It was most likely a cistern. And so the evidence doesn't support what I want to be true in my heart. Well, when I start to think about scripture, when I start to think about doctrine, if the evidence doesn't support what I want to be true in my heart, then I have to be open to something not being the case. That not Paul's prison. Well, like that, there's some things in doctrine that just can't be supported by the Bible. So I think it's an interesting connection in two ways. One, Luke does record these things, and they happened accurately, and there is a city, and there are parts of that city that would undoubtedly have a prison. Um, but just because I really want it to be Paul's prison does not, unfortunately, make it Paul's prison.
And by the way, and typically, you know, so many of these things, I think, man, we could talk forever about a lot of these components, but what about the types of imprisonment during that era? They really did not, in the Roman culture, have uh, places of incarceration for long term imprisonment of people like we have today. Mainly, people were put in holding cells. If they were not citizens, then they could put into a place that was just sort of temporary and that maybe was meant to just sort of lock you away forever. Well, I mean, like I said, it sounds contradictory. My point is that they could put you into a place that was not really intended to, keep you there for a 5-year sentence or whatever, or 20-year sentence or a 30-year sentence. If you were not a citizen, then you were guilty of some crime. You were probably just going to be put into a dungeon and left to die. Okay, that was it. If you were a citizen and charged with something, you could not be incarcerated like that. You could maybe be placed under house arrest, as Paul was as a citizen later on when he went to Rome. He had a number of freedoms still that he enjoyed as people came to visit him and so forth. So there are just some differences. You can't expect to go and find this large cell prison block, although they did have some types of places where they kept people. Paul was kept for 2 years at Caesarea while he was there. Some sort of room, some sort of place to detain people. So that those did exist, but maybe not like we're thinking about today when we think of our prison system.
Yeah, and we really could talk about this forever. And in that spirit, I'm going to talk just kind of briefly about some of the other things that were there, and then John, if you want to make a comment, we'll kind of stop and do this. But uh, just to get a sense of the site, it very much was an ancient Roman city. There's a forum, previously a Greek agora or just marketplace where people could buy and sell and do business, and they would talk and they'd spend time there. There was a platform for speaking. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. There was an Acropolis. We talk about this pretty much in every city. There is some sort of high place that typically has sanctuaries to pagan deities or things like that. It doesn't feature in the biblical narrative, and so it's not something that we really spend a lot of time thinking about. But there was an Acropolis. There was also a theater, a bath, a library, very Roman place. All of the things that you would expect to find in a Roman city, you would find in Philippi. And so when you go, you get to see ruins of all of these things, and do that. So, is there any? I guess my question for you, John, is there any one archaeological thing that we need to talk about?
I think that sometimes people wonder, well, do we have evidence in terms of toponyms, in terms of names of a particular place from the archaeological record that this is indeed the place? Because that's one of the things that gets disputed a lot. Well, at Philippi, right in the middle of the forum, among a number of other inscriptions that were the remains from buildings or on a pediment or something, or on maybe some sort of stone monument. There are tons of these all around that area of the Roman Forum. And one of them is a long inscription that names this place and people or a particular position there as a province of Macedonia in Philippi. So this is clearly Philippi. No one disputes that. No one argues that. So you've got that. I think you need to observe. There's also something else that is here that is present. Not only the fascists that I spoke about at the riverside, but in the middle of the forum that came from somewhere near the pediment of a building on that western side of the forum, there is the remains of a large shield with a spear behind it, and this has been found not in too many places, but in several places around the Mediterranean world that was connected to Roman military might and a Roman military presence. So engraved on this stone, on this pediment at the forum, is indicative of a large Roman military presence. Not so much maybe active military, but people who had served in the military, which to speak to the part of what we mentioned earlier in the podcast about this becoming a Roman colony as a military pension plan or whatever. But there are also inscriptions in this Roman forum dedicated to various Roman military heroes or personnel, even a sort of monument or funerary place, a burial site for a Greek hero, military hero that's here that was worshipped. So why do I bring all that up? Because there are some references, and this is a Roman place, Roman citizenship is emphasized, a Roman colony. And Paul makes reference to that in the book of Philippians, that he writes from Rome when he's in prison there back to this church that he dearly loved and who had supported him in the gospel. And he uses the word citizenship a couple of times to say, our citizenship is in heaven. Philippians chapter 3, verse 21. He speaks to them about being citizens of the kingdom of God and not of this world. So maybe it's a reminder that while though the people of Philippi really understood and appreciated, and some did, the Roman presence and that Roman colony and having that opportunity and their citizenship and where it came from, the reference in Philippians 3, verse 20, and then also there's one in chapter 1 of the book of Philippians where Paul makes reference to this Greek word that is connected to citizenship. So just as Roman citizens have a responsibility to their city, but they also have rights, so you as a citizen of God's kingdom have rights and privileges, but you have a lot of responsibilities as well. But also understand that it's not here on the earth; it's in the kingdom of God. So that's one thing I think that's important. And some, by the way, well, in thinking about, well, where was Paul tried? Probably at that southern end. I'm sorry, on that western end, where maybe these Roman buildings, official buildings, were, and where they could have brought them before the magistrates that were there. Was it at the Bema there that's been located again, an official trying spot like the one that's found at Corinth? So, by the way, you asked a question about, well, why do people do this? And I know again, maybe as a marketing scheme or just by tradition, it gets started. But I think also it's just neat to think about. I want to be where that took place. I'd like to be able to read this scripture in the actual location. And I do that. When we're there, I read Acts 16 and this section about Paul and Silas being brought before these rulers and then in prison. And, there's just a reminder of what they went through, what they endured, the sacrifices they made, the experiences that they had, and to see that it took place in a real place and a real time. All right. This is not myth. It's an actual circumstance. And so it's just sort of connects you to the site in a way to be able to say, I wonder where that is. And it'd be cool if we could find it. Right. Okay. So that's one. Anything you want to add on that before I go on to a couple of other things that I think people need to make sure they see when they're there, or to maybe know about and study on their own if you can't go there?
Exactly what you're saying. There are it's two places or maybe one place combined. There are some places in archaeology and history where you can say with certainty that something happened, or with a reasonable degree of certainty. One of the things about this site is there is actually a gate called the Neapolis Gate, and so we can say with a fair degree of certainty that if Paul landed in Neapolis and he walked down the Via Ignatia, which we said we would come back to, that's actually parts of it are still able to be walked on today. John and I have both been on sections of it, and and we've taken groups on sections of it, and we've walked down that road, and then to think about how that road cut right through this town, and there's a gate there called the Neapolis Gate. We can say with relative certainty, I can't put my exact finger on it, but we can say with relative certainty that Paul walked down this road and through this gate if he was coming from Neapolis to get into Philippi. And that's there's a lot to be said about that, but at the face of it, that's just cool. That's just neat. That we can indeed be in some of these same places, and the Bible is given to us, as we say all the time, in a real time, in a real place, in a real context. And sometimes you can put yourself in that same context and place.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, a couple other things that I think people want to be sure that they, stop to see and kind of consider while they're there, um, is not only as we mentioned, the basilica, the theater. Go back to the theater for just a moment. When you're exiting the theater, heading toward the basilica, look on one of the pillars there, going as you're exiting out, and there is a faint inscription, or a faint depiction, I should say, of the goddess Nike, and she is holding a wreath, um, a crown, and she's in one hand, and she's got a set of palm branches in the other. So we've seen this more than one time scattered around the Mediterranean, that the Bible writers then drew upon these things, and Jesus did as well in the book of Revelation, and talking about those who are victorious Christians, they're going to receive not a victory crown that comes from Nike, the goddess of victory, but from God. It's a crown of life. It is the Stephanos crown, the victory crown. And then one of the pictures in the book of Revelation of the souls that have overcome the persecution, and the 144,000, and those that are celebrating the victorious Christ and his coming. They've got palm branches in their hands, and those are like flags. Those are like symbolic of times of celebration and victory. So the very things that the Greek world and the Romans did as well used in their iconography to communicate a message of victory. The Bible says, "Well, let me show you who's really going to have these things." Okay, so they would have got it right. Palm branches in their hands, and victory crowns, and all that would have made a lot of sense. So right there in Philippi, there's that. So
So, John, we're kind of running down to the end of our time. So, before we go, though, what are the last things we need to take with us when we were thinking about Philippi?
well, I think that from an apologetic standpoint, and then maybe just from an exegetical standpoint, to better understand something here, two things that are worthy of our consideration and further study. And one is just how clear and how specific and accurate Luke is when he records that in Greek, that Philippi is the first city of this area. Now, some people in other translations, depending on how it's translated, you might come away with the idea that Luke is saying that Philippi is the capital city of the province, and that's not at all what he's saying. We know from the historical record that this province was divided up into four parts, so four districts, and that Philippi was the leading city of that first district. Okay, so in other words, if you look carefully at what the Greek says about it, the Greek language in the text, Luke had it precisely and exactly right, and that some translations don't translate it the way it should be. That's consistent with what we know about geography. Okay. So that's one thing that, you ought to consider when you're out there, is again, just how remarkable it is that Luke was so specific about things. Secondly, and this is something that maybe we can point you to an article that I wrote about, but when you read down a little later on, and um, Paul encounters this girl that has a spirit of divination, and he lets this go on for a while, and finally, she's saying, "These are servants of the Most High God, servants of the Most High God," and then finally, it's like he gets tired of it, and he says he casts the spirit out of her, right? And this creates a problem. Questions arise about what is going on here? What's this spirit of divination? And then two, why did he put up with it for so long? Okay. Well, number one, I think that this we need to know that the spirit of divination here uses a Greek word, pithos, that is actually the same word used to describe the oracle at Delphi, a woman who believed she was receiving these oracular messages, maybe from Apollo, right? Because the site is associated with Apollo, who came and killed this python that was guarding this site. And Apollo, he's the son of Zeus. He's come there because this is the most beautiful place on earth, and he wants it for himself. And so he kills this python. Thus, hence the Pythian games that develop from all of that, right? So this tradition develops that these women that were out there at this site would inhale these noxious fumes, and that under the influence of those fumes, they could utter these messages that came from the underworld that gave information about the future, so they could divine the future. So a lot of people came to Delphi to receive these revelations. Well, someone who has this same name or is connected to that, and that's the Greek word here. She's a python, as it were, would have been looked upon with great reputation and great significance, maybe in this area. Now, did she just bear the name because she thought it would get her a lot more attention? Did she come from Delphi? We don't know, but we know evidently that she was making these guys a great deal of money. And so the fact that Paul cast the spirit out of her indicates that they would have been pretty upset, because she would have been revered, and that would have been troubling for them. As a side note, just this year, archaeologists uncovered the head of a marble statue of what they believe to be the head of a statue of Apollos, right there in Philippi, right in Philippi. Okay, so that's another little interesting connection that says, okay, maybe she did have something to do with Delphi. All right. Well, what is she saying? She's saying that these men are servants of the Most High God. Was she saying that in belief that because Apollos sometimes was spoken of in just those terms as a Most High God, that maybe some after a while were thinking that she was saying they're servants of Apollo and of Apollos or something, and Paul said finally had enough? Or was it that Paul allowed it to go on for a while, and there was because he didn't want to be cast into prison yet. He needed time to preach the gospel to people, and allowed it to go on. But maybe some began to say, you know what? Is this from Apollos, or is this from the Jewish God? Who is this? And maybe people were getting confused, and Paul had enough, and he cast that demon out of her. But anyway, a lot more to be said about that. But I'm just saying that when you read the text and you read what Scripture says and you read it in the Greek language, what you're seeing is a connection to Delphi, a connection to that site, a little more insight as to maybe why Paul did what he did and what was happening, and why that occurred in the way that it did. So many more things, but those are two things to maybe think about and take with you as we end today's program.
John and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Bible Passages podcast. One of the missions of Bible Passages is to deliver as much free Bible content to people as possible, but we can't do that without your support. First, you can like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. Second, you can leave a comment on this video or this episode so that we know that you're listening. And third, if you feel compelled to give, you can do so at BiblePassages.net/give. Thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you in the next episode.